Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Well, oh, thank you. Like first grade. So welcome to this session. This is the Native Plants and Fire session. And I was thinking about this yesterday. I was sitting in the other sessions that we probably didn't need a completely separate session since almost every talk that I went to yesterday had some sort of fire embedded in the conversation. So I think it won't be a surprise to any of us that fire is a pretty fundamental process here in California. And today we have this pretty nice wide diversity of talks that will hopefully take us on sort of a whirlwind tour of the role of fire in California ecosystems. We're going to start in the grasslands and shrublands of Southern California, move up to the red fir and higher elevations of the Sierra Nevada, and end with kind of a region-wide exploration of fire in natural research areas. So I hope you enjoy it, and we're going to start right away so we can have enough time for our speakers. Our first speaker is Priscilla Ta. She comes to us from UC Irvine Center for Environmental Biology, and she has extensive experience in plant ecology research, and her talk today is going to be focused on the resilience of restored coastal sage scrub and grassland systems following wildfire. So Priscilla?
Okay, well, hello everyone, and good morning. Today I'm here to... Good morning. Hello, thank you for coming. Today I'm going to be talking about the resilience of restored coastal sage scrub and grassland systems following wildfire, and this was actually a capstone project completed by a group of students I mentored last year, so special thank you to Michelle, Jessica, Rubine, and Brianna. So let's begin. I'd also like to make some acknowledgments. First off, that our research was conducted on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Hashman and Tongva peoples. And I would also like to thank specifically these organizations, UCI MCRS, the Irvine Ranch Conservancy, Crystal Cove Conservancy, and the UC Irvine Center for Environmental Biology for their support throughout our research, and especially the B-flat capstone students. All right, so we're all here this morning to talk about fire. So let's talk about fire. Wildfire is a natural disturbance that is expected in California, and it can definitely provoke large-scale reductions in plant cover. And while our native plant communities are adapted to fire, increasing fire frequency and severity can in part due to climate change and human ignition, can definitely leave our native communities vulnerable to type conversions into, for example, non-native, dominated, degraded grasslands. And in October of 2020, there was a fire that occurred in Southern California, specifically the Silverado fire, that burned through a completed restoration site, which then opened up an opportunity to really study, okay, these restored systems, are they resilient to disturbances such as fire? So basically the overarching objective and goal of our project is to investigate the post-fire resilience of restored coastal sage scrub and grassland communities at B-flat Canyon in Orange County. So B-flat Canyon. B-flat Canyon is a 293-acre sub-watershed located in the foothills of the Santa Ana Mountains in Orange County, California. It's shown here on the map by the orange star, and basically the B-flat Canyon is comprised of many different types of native habitats. So we got our coastal sage, our grassland, our chaparral, and our oak woodlands, which are in need of restoration. And areas that contained less than 50% native cover were targeted for restoration. The restoration itself was conducted by the Irvine Ranch Conservancy starting in 2010, all up into 2020 when the project was finally signed off and completed, unfortunately a few months before the Silverado fire came and burned everything down. So I'm going to explain on the left here, the B-flat restoration site. So what we're looking at here is the outline of B-flat Canyon and the areas that were restored. So the different restored communities are represented by different colors. For example, areas designated for coastal sage scrub restoration are noted in orange. And the way that these areas were restored was, of course, there was a lot of thought and planning put into site preparation, so batch removal and grow-kill cycles to reduce non-native populations and basically clear space for seeding. And The areas were then drill seeded with a diverse mixture of native plant species following a strip planting design. And specifically, the Irvine Ranch Conservancy seeded strips of forbs and strips of shrubs separately in alternating fashion to enhance maintenance techniques. And throughout the course of restoration, of course, a intensive weed control program was implemented by the Irvine Ranch Conservancy to support the establishment of healthy coastal sage scrub. And of course, healthy coastal sage scrub is important. It's composed of shrubs and a diverse understory of forbs and grasses. They're important because they are centers for biodiversity and support large numbers of endangered and threatened species. And so we definitely want to make sure when we restore our coastal sage scrub that they're resilient to disturbances like fire or non-native invasion. So for our project, we are interested in assessing the resilience of restored coastal sage scrub communities in B-flat after fire by evaluating the success of their recovery tactics. All right, so the way that coastal sage scrub can recover after fire, specifically with regards to shrubs, is represented by the graphic on your right. And so basically, after fire goes through, shrubs can come back either by crown sprouting from existing shrub skeletons or completely germinate new from seed in the existing seed bank. And throughout this talk, I'm going to refer to shrubs that came back from seed as recruits. So with respect to how we evaluate post-fire resilience of restored coastal sage scrub communities, we were interested in answering these two questions, with the first one related to shrub recovery. How does the abundance of shrub crown sprouts and recruits compare across restoration treatment? And secondly, with regards to herbaceous recruitment, how does herbaceous cover, so forbs and grasses, compare across restoration treatment? And the way we designed our study to be able to answer both questions is in the after the fire that went through in 2020, we identified areas that burned at a similar intensity, and we identified areas that were, one, degraded, so in the orange. These are areas that are not restored and dominated by non-natives. We also identified areas that were restored, so previously degraded but now restored to coastal sage scrub, and finally intact, unrestored areas that historically had a high enough cover of coastal sage scrub to not necessitate restoration. As for our first question that was related to shrub recovery, we answered that by going out in fall of 2021 and setting out 12 1x5 meter quadrats in each treatment and counting and comparing the number of shrub crown sprouts and recruits present. As for how we evaluated post-fire herbaceous recruitment, in the spring of 2021 and 2022, we set out 1x1 meter quadrats and used the point intercept method to quantitatively compare native and non-native herbaceous cover in these three different treatments. All right, so let's move on to results. So with respect to shrub recovery, what we're looking at here is at the bottom, so the x-axis is the different treatments. You'll notice that their degraded treatment is not present, and that's because when we were sampling and analyzing, we found that we didn't actually find any shrub crown sprouts or recruits, so that was just excluded from our analysis. So on the left here, what we're looking at is crown sprout abundance, and what was interesting is that the restored areas actually had significantly more crown sprouts compared to intact areas, and that might be likely a result of the strip planting design, where areas that were restored had a higher density of mature established shrubs. And on the right, what we're looking at here is recruitment abundance. So again, those shrubs that came up from seed across the different restoration treatments. And here what we find interesting is that the restored areas actually had significantly less recruits from seed. And this might just be due to differences in the composition of the seed banks present in the different areas. So moving on to forb recruitment. On the left here, what we're looking at is native forb cover across the different treatments. And what is interesting to note is that the restored and intact areas both had significantly higher native forb cover compared to degraded areas, and also that the difference between restored areas and intact areas in terms of native cover was not significantly different, suggesting that native forb cover in restored areas were able to bounce back just as well as those in intact areas. As for the graph on the right, we're looking at non-native forb cover, and what we found is restored and intact areas both had significantly less non-native forb cover, and the difference between the two were insignificant. All right, so moving on to grass recruitment. On the left, we have native grass cover across the different treatments. What's interesting to note here is that the restored and degraded areas actually had significantly less native grass cover compared to the intact areas. And the difference between degraded and restored were insignificant, very similar. So basically suggesting that native grasses aren't able to bounce back as well in these restored areas. As for non-native grass cover, what we found is that degraded areas, of course, because they're unrestored, have the highest cover of non-native grasses, which is then followed by intact and restored, which is basically a testament to the Irvine Ranch Conservancy's success in terms of their invasive control. All right, so to wrap up the coastal sage aspect of the project, when we are thinking about the post-fire resilience of these restored coastal sage shrub communities with regard to shrub recovery, what we found is that restored areas actually contained more crown sprouts, so shrubs recovered by crown sprouting, and intact areas contain more recruits that germinated from seed. With regards to herbaceous recruitment, we found that restored and intact areas contain similarly high native forb cover, and that intact areas contain the highest native grass cover. And earlier in this presentation, I mentioned that we were interested in two different systems, coastal sage scrub and restored grassland. So we're going to bounce back to this large map of the entire restoration site. And what we're going to focus on now are the polygons, or the shapes represented by the yellow color. These are perennial grasslands that were restored in B Flat Canyon. And the way that they were restored is very similar to how the coastal sage shrub communities were restored, in that there was a lot of thought and effort put into site preparation and seeding and maintenance. And all of this was to be able to establish a healthy, of course, grassland community. And healthy grassland communities are also important because they are also home to many endangered and threatened species, and they're at high risk of degradation in part due to land use history or just like competition and invasion by non-natives. So it's important when we restore grasslands to make sure they're resilient to disturbances over time. So what we were interested in answering with regards to our grassland aspect of the study was, how does plant cover of restored grasslands change over time due to fire, temperature, and rain? And the way we answered that question is that we used data that the Irvine Ranch Conservancy collected, so long-term monitoring data on the restored grassland sites, and we specifically picked out 6 transects. And we picked out these 6 transects because these were the transects that had data before the fire in 2020 and then after the fire. So the time range is 2015 to 2022. And this is they were 50-meter transects, and it's, again, another way to quantitatively assess differences in cover. So moving on to the results for the restored grasslands, what we're looking at here on the left is forb cover over time. And so the blue line represents the native forb cover, and we see in the years leading up to fire, so 2015 to 2019, there's an increase in native forb cover, and then after the fire in 2020, there's a sharp decline. But 2 years after fire in 2022, there is again an uptick, so an increase in native forb cover. And the trend for non-native forbs was also similar, but something important to note is that throughout the entire course of 2015 to 2022, native forb cover was consistently higher than that of non-native forb cover. in these restored grasslands. And on the right, what we're looking at here is grass cover over time. Again, similarly for native grass cover, what we're seeing is in the years leading up to fire, 2015 to 2019, there's an increase in native grass cover, followed by a sharp decline after the fire in 2020, and a continued decline up until the year we most recently sampled, which was 2022. As for non-native grass cover, we see that in the years leading up to fire, there was an increase, and after the fire, there was a slight decrease, but ultimately, 2 years after fire in 2022, there was an increase. In fact, a near 20% increase in non-native grass cover. And I mentioned earlier that we were also interested in evaluating the impact of temperature and precipitation on vegetation cover, and we found that, at least for our site in our study, temperature and precipitation did not have an influence on vegetation cover. So what we're really, at least what I think we're really seeing here is that fire, the disturbance, and potentially competition with non-native forbs and non-native grasses is what's really driving this change, and also maybe perhaps preventing native grasses from recovering as well. So to wrap up the grassland portion of the project, basically what we found were native forbs are more resilient to fire compared to native grasses, which is similar to what we found for our coastal sage scrub. Native grass cover, in our case, a lot of our native grasslands were primarily just dominated by Stipopulca. So basically Stipopulca cover failed to increase after fire. And what we found in our study is that fire and non-native competition appeared to be what drove changes in community composition. So what does this all mean with respect to our entire project? So again, our overarching goal was to assess the post-fire resilience of restored coastal sage scrub and grassland communities at B-Flat Canyon. And what we found with respect to coastal sage scrub is that the Irvine Ranch Conservancy was able to restore a resilient community. What we saw was as little as 1 year after fire, native forbs and shrubs are bouncing back. And for restored native grassland, however, that was not the case, which suggests the need for implementing an invasive control system. And thank you. Sorry, I'm a little over time, but thank you. Question. I'm sure Irvine Ranch Conservancy would be able to speak better. That's a great question. And I'm sure the Irvine Ranch Conservancy would be able to speak better, but from what I've read, they implemented many different methods from pulling to herbicide and additional methods. Yes.
Originally, you said that if it was less than 50% vegetated as opposed to bare ground, that was chosen to do restoration. Why did they choose that metric?
That is also a great question. I'm not sure if I'm the best person to speak about why they specifically decided on 50% native cover as the threshold, but I would think that perhaps anything below 50% would mean that there is a more significant need and to restore those areas and prioritize those areas. Yes. Okay.
In the restoration areas, what pertained to restoration? Was it degraded areas that were then weeded, and then you planted shrubs and forbs, or just shrubs and then?
Yeah, so for the coastal sage scrub areas that were restored, they were previously degraded. So B-Flat Canyon is primarily just like a lot of non-native grass and a lot of non-native mustard. And so they were prepared, so weeds were removed, and then those areas were then drill seeded following a strip design. So forbs and shrubs were added to the site.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Hailey Laskey. Hailey Laskey is a preserve manager for the Center of Natural Lands Management and manages the natural resources at the Santa Rosa Plateau Ecological Reserve in Murrieta, California. She monitors sensitive species and manages invasive plants while working closely with partnering agencies to provide responsible access to the state ecological reserve. She's going to be talking to us today about 20 years of prescribed fire within the grasslands at the Santa Rosa Plateau Ecological Reserve.
Good morning, everyone. As Michelle said, my name is Hailey Laskey, and I work for the Center for Natural Lands Management, and I'm here to share with you 2 decades of prescribed fire at the Plateau. If you're unfamiliar with the Santa Rosa Plateau, it's a jewel in western Riverside County in Murrieta, California. It's about 10,000 acres. It's composed of oak woodlands. We have vernal pools. We have chaparral. We have amazing riparian areas with a lot of sensitive species. And most importantly today, we have about 3,500 acres of perennial grassland. And we have the Center for Natural Lands Management has been managing the natural resources at the Plateau for about 4 years now with a contract with the Nature Conservancy. So we implement we have a vegetation management plan with CAL FIRE, where we implement prescribed fire within the multiple management units. So we have 14 management units. 2 of those units are control units, and we have 83 vegetation transects within those units. Some of the characteristic grassland species our natives are dominated by sepulchra bunchgrass, and then we have a lot of herbaceous perennials like Cistrynchium and the other geophytes. But we, of course, have our other forbs like Clarkia, Lysenia, and poppies. We also have, of course, the non-native annual grasses, which is the Avena species, the Bromus species. The non-native forbs are mostly dominated by like Lactuca, Hirschfeldia ancana, mustards, and rhodium is a big one as well. We also have jointed goat grass, which is actually brought in from prescribed fire activities, and then we hope to treat with prescribed fire. So at the Santa Rosa Plateau, over the last 30 years, the Nature Conservancy has implemented a prescribed fire within the rotating management units in the grasslands. And this was to reduce thatch and cover of non-native annual grasses after the removal of cattle in the 80s. We also use prescribed fire to manage non-native forbs, like this picture where we're burning 80 acres of yellow star thistle. Yes. And overall, it's to promote the growth of the native species and try to encourage recruitment of perennial grasses. So we also have LMS species, but our dominant and most well-tracked species is Stipopulchra. So we have 21 years of data from the Vegetation Monitoring Program. A lot of this was collected by my colleague, Zach Principe at the Nature Conservancy, and actually 11 years ago he gave the same presentation with data from 2001 to 2006. So here I am adding to that and kind of giving everyone an update. I'm not sure if you guys were there in 2011. So when the Center for Natural Lands Management took over managing the plateau a few years ago, we were asked to come up with a prescribed fire plan for the grasslands at the plateau. However, this is a little bit complicated. I mean, at this point in time, at least every single one of those management units has been burned at least once or maybe even twice. There's also some wildfire in there as well. And so when we're asked to do a prescribed fire plan, we needed to look at every single year and try to understand what's happening within these management units over time. But as you can see, it's pretty complicated. On the right, we have precipitation. On the left, we have percent cover. And throughout the entire presentation, the colors will remain the same. So native forb will be yellow, non-native forb will be orange, native grass will be green, non-native grass will be gray, and the total cover will be in black. So So being asked to write a prescribed fire plan is a little bit difficult when we have extreme variation within our grasslands over time. We also had a lot more drought in the last 20 years, or in the last 10 years of the 20-year timeline. To try and piece this apart and look at what was really influencing and understanding the trends with time and precipitation, we found that for all functional groups, cover was significantly changed over time, and we can see that here, and that all of the functional groups except for native grass cover, which actually Priscilla just said, that native grass cover is not significantly influenced by precipitation in Southern California. So this is all of the data combined. It's pretty messy and it's hard to piece things out. So we're going to take a step into looking at these individual management units one by one. So I'm going to talk about these management units, I'm going to talk about our control units, and then I'm going to talk about a few characteristic management units that kind of paint the picture of what's happening in the grasslands. So our control units, we have two control units, and one of the control units was, we have data for 21 years, and then another control unit, we only have data from 2001 to 2006, and then I recently started collecting data on that again, just to see how it was doing. Without any management, native grass cover has decreased 40% in the last 20 years. And non-native grass cover has significantly increased in the last 20 years. We have fluctuations between our non-native forbs. They're really significantly tied to precipitation, and our non-native forb cover pretty much stays consistent over time. There's no significant increases from year to year, and then maybe sometimes it's not significantly influenced by precipitation. So what does prescribed fire do to these functional groups? So I'm going to talk about one of our management units where we have a good data set from. This is the Clay Hill management unit. It's about 300 acres, and it's mostly comprised of clay and a lot of cyphopulchra and an amazing geophyte community. Data was collected between 2001 and 2008 without any kind of management at all, and then in 2013, during the drought, the Nature Conservancy conducted a prescribed fire. So after that prescribed fire, we saw that native forb cover really didn't change after prescribed fire. Non-native forb cover in orange increased after prescribed fire, and non-native grass cover decreases after fire, but it recovers within 6 years. So it takes some time, but it does increase over time. And then after prescribed fire, non-native grass cover decreases, but shoots straight back up. Even higher to pre-fire levels. So I also want to share with you kind of where we have multiple disturbances in the grasslands, one right after another. So in 2016, there was a prescribed fire, and then in 2019, within this management unit, there was a wildfire. And I'm going to share with you, so non-native grass cover after the prescribed fire decreased, and then also native grass cover decreased after prescribed fire, and non-native grass cover actually increased after prescribed fire. And then we have 3 years later, a wildfire goes through there in the fall. Native grass cover increased, and also non-native grass cover increased. It's been pretty variable, but we also had droughts in 2018, but in 2019, 2020, and 2022, we had relatively good rain years. So with most of the data being collected throughout our historic drought, we wanted to look at how the role of drought helps manage non-native annual grasses, and as the Nature Conservancy used prescribed fire during drought years, which was a tough decision to make, as you want to still control non-native annual grasses, but yet you can't predict rainfall from year to year. So in 2017, we had a really great rainfall at the Santa Rosa Plateau, and then in 2018, we had about 6 inches of rain, so a really great drought. However, this is 5 years after that prescribed fire, and this is the only data that I have over the last 20 years where native grass cover has actually increased after a prescribed fire. And I think that could be the influence of drought and the timing of the prescribed fire. However, it did control non-native grass cover, but in its place we had non-native forbs. So when we were asked to create a prescribed fire plan, we're looking at this data, and it's pretty complex. We're seeing some gaps, and we're not quite sure that maybe implementing a prescribed fire plan within these different management units is the right way to go. What we're noticing is that native grass cover has not increased at all after prescribed fire, with and without management action. So we have a decrease in native grass cover over time, and it's not significantly related to precipitation, so there's something else that's really affecting it, and it's likely the non-native annual grasses. Wildfire does reduce native grass cover and non-native grass cover. Native grass cover bounces back with about 1 to 2 years, and native grass cover takes about 5 to 6 years to recover. We have an increase in non-native grass cover over time and with precipitation, and it just continues to increase. And native forb cover is steady, but we've noticed within most of our management units, we have a really low seed bank. So we're looking at what we're going to do next at the Santa Rosa Plateau, and it's not quite sure that we're going to go with a prescribed fire plan. It looks like we need to do some kind of grassland restoration, an enhancement plan. So we really want to understand and investigate Stipropulchra bunch size and density. So I only talked about cover data, and that was cover on a 50-meter transect. And in the wetter years, Stipropulchra can be more robust, and so you're more likely to pick it up on a transect, right? And also in drier years, you don't have as tall non-native annual grasses, so it's easier actually to detect Stipropulchra in drier years. So cover might not be a good indicator of native grass bunch density at the Santa Rosa Plateau. We also have some concerns with our sample size. We're not quite sure if the data that we have is really letting us know exactly what's happening out there, so maybe increasing our sample size, adding more transects within these management units. And, adding to that, just doing more detailed plot-based activities, looking at species richness. However, for our native forbs, we have pretty much the consistent species list of native forbs. There's not too much diversity over time, even with wildfire and prescribed fire. And also in Southern California, because it's getting drier. So we also want to investigate vapor pressure deficit and see if just analyze like winter precipitation with our cover. And fire intensity with prescribed fire versus wildfire is very different. So at the Plateau, we implement May prescribed fires, which we're trying to capture the seed bank of, the aerial seed bank of the non-native annual grasses. But that's very difficult as CAL FIRE, it's a controlled burn, so these fires burn slowly and they're not as intense, and they don't actually kill all of the non-native annual grass seed. So maybe implementing hotter prescribed fires. And we've considered using sheep, bringing in sheep. However, there's some logistical concerns as during the wet season, the roads are pretty much impassable because they are very clay. And we definitely want to add seed to our plots because we have a low native seed bank. So that is our next steps on managing the grasslands at the Santa Rosa Plateau. So thank you so much.
I'm very new to all of this, but I'm comparing what you're saying to what the Indigenous people were saying. And I'm wondering if you guys shouldn't talk to some Indigenous people, because they saw significant gains with native grasses after burns. But you have to do it in a nuanced way. You have to come in with fire just as the non-natives are sprouting, get that out. I can't even explain how they did it, but it was much more nuanced. And they said there's a real difference between cultural burning and prescribed burning, that the levels and the heat of the fire and the cycle. I mean, if it's only being done every 6 or 10 or 20 years, it's not enough. It needs to happen 3 or 4 years between.
Yeah, so CAL FIRE has the main relationship with our local tribe. I have not had the privilege of getting in on that relationship just yet, but yes, that's definitely in the future, is getting more information, and that's part of like the grassland enhancement plan. Yeah. Thank you. Great question. Thanks.
Do you have issues with shrub encroachment into your grasslands that fire might be addressing, even if it isn't addressing these issues with native grass recruitment?
I don't, within the like actively managed management units, we don't have any shrub encroachment, but actually in the control unit that I only have about 8 years of data on, I have seen coyote brush starting to invade the grassland, and I actually calculated we have a 40% increase in coyote brush invading the grassland. So, yeah, I don't think it'll be a control unit anymore.
Are you aware of anywhere in California where grasslands have been successfully converted back to a primarily native forb or native grass community?
No. If anybody in the room knows that, they...
All right, another quick question. Cypropulchra has been mentioned a few times. Is it possible that melicas and poas and other grasses were more preferred by grazers? So cows. So might you, when you do the restoration, might you include other native grasses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't really, I haven't started creating my seed list, but yeah, that's a great question. And trying to figure out what the historical plant list was, historical being in the 80s, would be great to get as well. Thanks.
I had a question about the timing of the fire. So I know that getting prescribed fire done in Southern California is really difficult because of the amount of pollution all over Southern California and the regulations of when fire can take place, prescribed fire. Are all of the prescribed fires that you guys are doing on the preserve, are they in the spring? Okay.
Yeah, so CAL FIRE does their training classes, and they usually schedule them for May. However, where we are in Southern California, we're right on the other side of Camp Pendleton, so we have a pretty great coastal influence. However, we're still part of the South Coast AQMD, and so that has been a challenge, but we have a good relationship, and so we've been able to get our prescribed fires approved.
That's super cool. Is there any hope for getting prescribed fires done in the fall or winter?
Yeah, I would love to do them earlier. Yeah. Fall is very difficult in Southern California. It's a bit fiery, so winter would be better. However, it's the issue is everything's really green, and there's a lot of morning dew, and that's really hard to carry fire and make it hot enough, especially if we wanted to kill the jointed goat grass. So, I had the example of the yellow star thistle prescribed fire. I actually asked CAL FIRE to burn that with the wind so they could burn off the standing, living yellow star thistle, and that was a good conversation. But we were able to create a larger containment line, and then they were able to implement the prescribed fire in that way. So it can be done. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
You mentioned that the cattle were removed in the 1980s. What influence do you think that had on the native grass cover?
I I'm not quite sure. So the Nature Conservancy started using a lot more prescribed fire in the 80s because I think it was a more affordable tool. But from what I have seen in pictures of the plateau from the 80s and what I see right now, there was like no non-native grass cover or non-native grass thatch. So perhaps Cyphopulchra cover was better, but I can't speak to the grazing intensity, so I'm not quite sure. Thank you.
Okay. So our next speaker is a colleague of mine, Marc Meyer, in the Forest Service Regional Ecology Program. He serves the Inyo, Sequoia, and Sierra National Forests, and his work focuses on integrating science information into land management, planning, and ecological restoration projects in the southern Sierra Nevada of California. And today he's going to be talking about the reestablishment of natural fire regimes in California's red fir forests. Thanks, Marc.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm going to take us on our tour of fire in California's ecosystems, as Michelle started us with, a little bit higher in elevation as we've been hearing our last couple talks, which have been really fascinating to me. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge Kyle Merriam and Michelle Coppoletta, our chair to today's session, as key partners in this, collaborators in this effort to examine fire in red fir ecosystems of California. As well as there's so many collaborators involved here, I couldn't fit them on the slide. There's a number from the Forest Service and Park Service, and others have been involved in this work over the past several years. So a little background about red fir forests here in California for those who aren't that familiar with them. They're very unique ecosystems here in the state, occur and dominate many parts of the upper montane zone, along with Jeffrey pine and lodgepole pine forests. They're notable in that they attain some of the highest levels of biomass of any forest ecosystem type in the state, with maybe the exception of coastal redwood forests. They have very high levels of carbon and biomass. And they're very strongly associated with high levels of snowpack in the state. So this has important implications when we're thinking about climate change and projections in declining and decreasing snowpack is going to have, as projected, some pretty significant impacts on red fir forests. And one positive note on red fir, I'd say, is that their remoteness provides a lot of opportunities to manage these ecosystems using wildfires. Using wildfire as a tool may be more feasible, and especially at large scales within this ecosystem. Nevertheless, there are some negative parts to report on for red fir, unfortunately, in that any of you who have been in the red fir forest zone, especially in the Sierra Nevada, have probably noticed this. There's significant increases in mortality rates and crown loss occurring in these forest ecosystems. And initially, this is about 10 years ago, many of the forest health experts attributed this to more classically what we see in terms of what's called branch flagging localized crown mortality and crown loss in these tree species attributed to dwarf mistletoe, Cytospora canker, fir engraver, some of these classic pathogens and insects that we find in red fir forests. And it's really started, I think, a lot of our tree-related, drought-related mortality that we saw, particularly in the ponderosa pine, some of the lower montane zone of California in that 2012 to 2016 drought, was, this mortality and crown loss event in red fir preceded even the California drought. So clearly there was something going on just beyond just the temporary effects of drought in California. This led myself and others to suspect that one of the big drivers here is climate change driving these patterns, particularly so we have our warming trends, clear warming trends in the Sierra Nevada, Southern Cascades, Klamath Mountains, and other montane regions of California, but also a potential factor that can be playing in here is fire exclusion. So these forest ecosystems, as in many of our upper montane forest ecosystems in California, have experienced about 100 to 150 plus years of fire exclusion. So we suspect that maybe this was a factor. And associated with that fire exclusion is the increase in our tree densities, especially in the smaller and medium-sized classes. So this really beg the question as to whether we can restore a key ecological process by using wildfire to help reestablish these natural fire regimes and restore the structure, composition, health of these forest ecosystems. And there's a variety of benefits of fire, the reintroduction of natural fire regimes in redford forests. We can improve the structure by reducing the tree densities, cover and overall biomass, increase understory diversity, species richness, for example, and improve the health of these forest ecosystems by reducing the moisture stress experienced by trees, especially the large trees, and the incidence of insects and pathogens. So this was our just really overarching study objective, was try to compare redford stands that had occurred in fire-excluded and active fire regime landscapes. To look at the structure, diversity, and health of these ecosystems, and evaluate the potential use of wildfire as a management tool. And our general approach and study design was really to look at what we call contemporary reference landscapes. These are landscapes where, as you can see in terms of our criteria, one was really looking at fire that had burned in the past few decades since 1984, but maybe more importantly is that there was little fire return interval departure. This is where our current fire return interval in recent decades is similar to the historical or pre-settlement, pre-colonization fire regime interval or fire frequency in these ecosystems. In red fir, which burned historically about every 30 to up to 80 years, but maybe on average it was about 40 to 40, or maybe about 35, 40, 45 years, this comes to about 2 fire return intervals, possibly 3, that have been quote-unquote missed in these ecosystem types. So by simply putting reestablishing the natural fire frequency within a couple intervals, you can usually get it back to that historical fire frequency. And of course, we wanted to, for these contemporary reference landscapes, focus on areas that have been dominated by red fir and have never been logged. This led to the establishment of about 80 plots in the Sierra Nevada across 32 overlapping wildfires. And in the Cascade Klamath, we had about 32 plots in 7 overlapping wildfires. This map across the state and individual study sites shows those 80 plots in the Sierra Nevada, primarily in Yosemite National Park, Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks, Giant Sequoia National Monument in those lower 2 maps, Lassen Volcanic National Park in the upper right, and then the Marble Mountains Wilderness in the upper left. Our data focused on structural components. There are a variety of other metrics we measure here, and just for the sake of time, I'm today focusing on tree density by size class, mean tree diameter. For diversity, we looked at species richness, particular patterns of shrubs, tree regeneration, and herbaceous plants. And for red fir health, we used what was a crown loss rating based on a Hawksworth dwarf mistletoe rating system, which was an indicator of both tree moisture stress and dwarf mistletoe abundance and occurrence. What we did in terms of our data analysis and evaluation was really simply to compare our stand variables between unburned and twice burned plots. And then what I like to do a lot these days is use the natural rate of variation or historical range of variation as an additional visual comparison, not statistical comparison. And the interesting thing about using this data set is that we're using a relatively independent data source that's based on historical stand inventories conducted back in the 1920s and 30s by Wieslander, also known as the Vegetation Type Mapping or VTM project. And then further on our analysis, we just to start to maybe get at some of those explanatory factors, use a generalized linear mixed model, AIC approach, to look at some of our the top suspected variables and models which are based on fire topography and site productivity. So here's some results. Very simply presented means and standard deviations here. We see tree density. Not surprisingly, after a couple of wildfire entries, or wildfire entries, you see there's a significant drop in tree densities, and those numbers very closely approximate what we see in terms of the natural range variation based on that VTM data set. Mean diameter, once you remove a lot of those smaller to medium-sized trees, there's not surprisingly the mean diameter goes up pretty significantly in the burn compared to the unburned plots, and that also approximates what we saw in the historical data set. This one is a little bit more, requires a little more explanation of trees and clusters. Historically, a lot of trees in these red fir and also montane stands occurred in what we call an icostructure, where you have individual trees, clusters of trees, and openings. Well, with fire exclusion, a lot of those trees, the openings filled in, the individual trees were surrounded by additional clusters of trees, so you have a high level of clustering that occurs, especially at small spatial scales. And that's what we're seeing here is the percentage of trees in very tight clusters where trees are within 1 meter of one another. And once again, you see this reduction in tree clustering with burning, and that also approximates what we see in the natural range variation. So the increasing in the incidence of those individual trees as observed in many historical reference stands. Species richness. We see significant increase in species richness in shrubs and tree regeneration with burning. And we also see, if we're looking across the full suite of species, understory herbaceous plants, as well as shrub species in this figure showing understory species diversity, significantly increased richness, no difference in evenness after a couple fire entries. Now, to look a little bit more at this crown loss rating analysis, the take home here is it was really topography that drove the pattern. So crown loss seems to be associated most strongly with lower elevations and south-facing aspects compared to lower levels of crown loss at those higher elevation, north-facing aspects, and so on. The effect of burning was negligible to non-existent in terms of our model selection. The top models and the best models, second best model that was in the base model showed some marginal support, benefits of fire in terms of reducing crown loss, but really it was driven by topography. And no effect, very little support for those stand biomass or live basal area models. This next set of figures is now breaking down that first figure I showed in terms of stand density, and we're going to look at it by size class, these diameter classes. And what you can see in the Sierra Nevada, we're going to start with, is overall 77% drop in tree densities, but you can see in which size class it's taking place. It's in the small to medium diameter classes. This is kind of what we'd expect. As fire moves in, it kills a lot of those smaller, quote-unquote, ladder fuels, and even some of those medium-sized diameter trees. Compare that to the Cascade-Klamath region. In the southern Cascades and the Klamath Mountains, we just, by convenience, combined those two bioregions since they had similar climate and other features. But what you can see is that there's a far fewer range of those size classes. In fact, it's just the 10 to 30 centimeter diameter class where you see a significant drop. And the overall difference is less, 77 versus 53%. Similarly, we can look at this just by comparing the burn plots to the VTM or historical data set. And what you see, there's no statistical comparison here, but just the overall numbers, which you can see is less of a difference between those two data sets in the burn versus the VTM in Sierra Nevada versus Cascade-Klamath. And I think there's a couple things going on. Obviously, I'll get to the first one, which is it seems clear there's greater overall differences in the Sierra Nevada versus Cascade-Klamath. But it's also interesting to note, and I think we forget this sometimes when we use the VTM and other historical data sets, that the tree densities here in the burned are lower than what we saw in the VTM data set, and I suspect that's because VTM data set was based on inventories done in the 1920s and 30s. But remember, a lot of the fire exclusion and the removal of fire's key ecosystem process in these montane and upper montane ecosystems started in about the mid-19th century. So already looking at about 60, 70, maybe even more years of fire exclusion, even with the historical data set. So that's probably leaving out many of those. There's already a significant amount of tree colonization and incursion following that those several decades of fire removal. So this gets to what may be going on between those two regions. Why is there a difference? The first thing I think myself and many of my colleagues thought was, well, it could simply be because in the Sierra Nevada, if you look at the historical fire frequency, it's actually more frequent in the Sierra Nevada than the Cascade Klamath. It's maybe not a huge amount, but there is a difference. And so if you look at a variable like our fire return interval departure, percent FRID, it does indicate in the Sierra Nevada there's a higher level of departure than this Cascade Klamath. So that may be what's going on. But, there isn't a huge difference in those values. So it also makes you suspect that there might be some climate factors playing in here, including snowpack, actual evapotranspiration, AET, or climatic water deficit, CWD. Essentially, it comes down to this. Like, areas in the Sierra Nevada are drier compared to the Cascade Klamath, and they're experiencing more moisture stress. So this may be driving greater levels of fire intensity or fire severity and fire effects in those red fir stands in the Sierra Nevada versus the Cascade Klamath. But this is, our supposition. We don't have a lot of mechanistic understanding if that's the case. In conclusion, we saw substantially lower tree densities, greater mean tree diameter, and fewer trees for clusters in burned versus unburned red fir stands. And I didn't show all my data to show this second point today, but we did see just overall there's an indication on our study and some other studies that show that you put fire back into these stands with it more or less with its historical fire frequency and fire regime, fire severity patterns, and you do see greater heterogeneity in these red fir stands. There's also clearly greater understory plant diversity, whether you're talking about trees, shrubs, or herbaceous vegetation in these systems. It does help that they're not completely dominated by non-native grasses. That's one of the advantages of working in red fir. Very few non-native species. But the red fir crown loss rating really seems to be positively related to increased topographic moisture stress rather than so much the influence of fire. Appears to have a fairly negligible or no real strong influence at all on crown loss rating. And the greater fire effects in the Sierra Nevada versus the Cascade Klamath really is borne out in however you look at it, if you're doing a burn-unburn comparison or comparing the burn sites to the historical data set. And this is likely a consequence of the fire return interval departure be greater in the Sierra Nevada, but also these climate variables. Essentially, these warmer and drier conditions are increasing the availability of fuel to burn in these systems and increasing the susceptibility of trees to fire-related mortality in the Sierra Nevada versus the Cascade Klamath. And that's probably what's driving those differences in those patterns in those two fire regions. Management implications. It comes down to fire has a little effect on red fir forest health, especially in areas of greater projected climate exposure. But you know what? Fire does have a lot of benefits in terms of red fir forests in that it significantly restores that stand structure and diversity. There's other factors that have been shown today, like it does significantly reduce certain elements of surface fuel loading, makes it more resilient to fire over time. And I'd argue it strongly builds the adaptive capacity of red fir forests by increasing regeneration, diversity, enhancing the structural complexity of the systems, and it retains some of those key structures. If you notice in those size class distribution figures, it really didn't have a significant reduction in terms of those large trees, which holds much of the biomass carbon, really important wildlife habitat structures in red fir forests. And, when it comes down to it, the combination of these data sets, I think, is most important when we're thinking about reference conditions, so not just using a FRID data set, a fire return interval departure data set, or historical data. They all have their limitations, but when you pull them together, they can be really, really insightful. And I want to put the plug in, I think, for particularly using these contemporary reference landscapes, these landscapes where they've never been logged, they're more or less within a historical fire return interval. They do provide really excellent examples of living laboratories where we can better understand these ecosystems, because they not only represent that current condition with an active fire regime, but it's also representing these current conditions when climate change is occurring and acting out of these landscapes. So it really provides those excellent locations for understanding red fir and other systems. And for more information, we have a couple publications out there. Feel free to take a look at those. And with that, just acknowledge our field crews, the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Region for their support of this program and this project, and Yosemite Field Station for housing our crews over the years. So thank you so much for your attention.
restoring fire in a system that didn't experience frequent low-severity fire, where fire was more mixed or generally of higher severity than our lower elevation forests. And especially doing that at a time, like the logistics of doing that at a time where fires are getting bigger and more severe in general.
Yeah, sure. Great question. I'll say the one other red fir, I am a red fir lover. I will acknowledge that. And one of my loves of red fir was writing a very thick general technical report. And actually a couple, also one with Michelle, our session chair here, looking at red fir. I think one of the important things that come out of that, especially for the Sierra Nevada red fir forest, is I think they're a little misunderstood in that they may not be as much of a classic mixed severity fire regime as we think, that there was actually a lot more low to moderate severity in that system historically than may have been previously appreciated. So I think the low to moderate severity can be really beneficial, and I think some of the work by Ben Kane at University of Washington, based on the LIDAR data that they've analyzed, shows us as well, is that red fir actually can benefit greatly from a low severity reintroduction of low severity fire into that system, more so than maybe even the yellow pine mixed conifer zone, where oftentimes we're seeing the moderate severity might be most beneficial as a first entry. But I think even with that said, there's a lot of benefits of that kind of moderate to limited amount of high severity in that system that really, I think, can bring red fir systems back into, as you can see here, and our examples of the only, there's other studies that have been done in red fir in California elsewhere that show this low to moderate severity predominant fire regime in the system really does bring the structure, composition, and diversity back in the system pretty quickly. Yeah, great question.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay. So our next speaker is Raphaela Floreani Buzbee, and she comes to us from UC Berkeley, where she's a PhD candidate in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management. She has over a decade of professional experience as a botanist and vegetation ecologist across California, and her research interests include climate-driven changes in patterns of vegetation, landscape stewardship, and cultural engagement. And today she's going to be talking, the title of her talk is Searching for Good Fire. Does managed wildfire support both fuels reduction goals and native plant diversity? We'll find out.
Okay, hi everybody, good morning. Thank you, Michelle. And then I'll also, I guess I should keep spacing this way. I'll also introduce my co-author, Zach Steele, who's a research biological scientist for the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. And I also like to start out with acknowledgments because I want to make it clear that everything that I'm presenting today was made possible by the work and collaboration of many people. And so I'd like to thank and recognize my advisors, my lab members, and awesome field crews over the past 2 summers. And while we're on the subject of acknowledgments, I'll also take a moment to acknowledge that the work I'm presenting took place on the homelands of Indigenous people from multiple tribes and nations. 2 of these tribes are currently seeking self-determination through the federal recognition process, and there are multiple ways that we all can contribute to and support these efforts. All right, so I'm going to be talking today a little bit about managed wildfire and biodiversity. Those are some key terms that I'll explain before introducing my project and study sites, and then I'll discuss our methods and some preliminary results before concluding and sharing our next steps. So managed wildfire is similar to what Marc was talking about with the, oh, now I already forgot, wildland fire. So managed wildfire, we know that a lot of plants and places in California need fire as an important ecological process, and after over a century of fire suppression and the exclusion of indigenous burning, many forests in California are fire prone and they're loaded with dense trees and high fuel loads. Managed wildfire is an approach for restoring fire regimes at the landscape scale, and under a managed wildfire policy, naturally ignited fires mostly from lightning, are allowed to burn. And since most managed wildfires occur in remote wilderness areas, this is a generally safe and cost-efficient way to reduce fuel loads where other management actions are just not feasible. And by reducing fuels, this approach is also hopefully reducing the risk and severity of future wildfires. And although managed wildfire is currently used in some areas of California, a lot of the ecological implications haven't been fully researched, such as carbon sequestration dynamics or biodiversity response. And biodiversity is basically that over time, a managed wildfire strategy or other fire strategies can create a patchwork pattern of overlapping fire histories, which is called biodiversity and represents spatial and temporal variation within and between fires. It's calculated from multiple metrics like fire return interval, the seasonality, extent, and severity of fires. Biodiversity also results in increased landscape heterogeneity and other effects, which has been reflected in biological diversity. So while there is some evidence that biodiversity promotes biodiversity in California forest ecosystems, most existing studies have used different definitions of biodiversity or have focused primarily on fire severity itself rather than including other facets of the fire regime, like the ones I was talking about earlier, fire frequency or seasonality. So my colleague and collaborator, Zach Steele, developed a research project to investigate which components of biodiversity are promoting biodiversity across taxa in the Sierra Nevada, surveying plants, birds, and bats over various fire histories and different implementations of managed wildfire. I'll also just say that Zach is giving a talk later this morning on Sierra Nevada conifer forests, so I would encourage everyone to attend that. And I became involved in this project as a botanist, and based on my background in botany and vegetation ecology, I developed my own set of research questions. I wanted to know if areas with managed wildfire have higher native plant diversity, if there's a relationship between plant species richness and total fuel loads, and what factors or conditions are contributing to plant species richness. We hypothesized that areas characterized by a near-natural fire regime would have both lower fuel loads and higher native plant diversity. And this research took place over 3 study sites that were selected based on their varied implementation of managed wildfire. Our first study site is the Badger Pass ski area in Yosemite National Park. The site was selected as a reference site because there have been no fires in this area in recent history. And a lot of this area is those red fir forests that Marc was just talking about. It's a really productive site in the sense that there are really large diameter red firs and then a lot of large woody debris, especially on some of these wetter north-facing slopes. Our second study site is the North Fork of the San Joaquin River Basin. This is located in Ansel Adams Wilderness in Sierra National Forest. And this area has had a full fire suppression policy until fairly recently. There had been a few smaller wildfires, but in 2018 the Lions Fire burned over most of this area, resulting in a lot of tree mortality, but also a lot of herbaceous recovery over the past few years. And then the third site is the Illilouette Creek Basin, also in Yosemite National Park. The Illilouette has had a policy of managed wildfire since 1972, and the frequency and extent of current fires there is pretty similar to the historic fire record, indicating that a near-natural fire regime has been reestablished. And because of this unique fire history, the Illilouette Creek Basin has served as a research site over the past 30-plus years. So in this map on the right, you can see the number of times that different areas in the Illilouette Creek Basin have burned through managed wildfire between 1973 and 2011. You'll see that the fire pattern is sort of in this jigsaw puzzle pattern, where some fires were limited by the extent of previous fires and others reburned over larger areas. And you might also notice that the majority of the basin has burned once or twice over this time period, and then a few small patches have burned 3 or 4 times. For field methods, we surveyed a number of plots across these 3 study sites. Forest inventories and fuel measurements were taken at all the plots. And to characterize fuel loads, we did 3 Brown's transects per plot. If you're not familiar with Brown's transects, that's a way to measure fuels based on different size classes. And this is done by literally just counting the sticks on the ground. So if you haven't done it, you might want to check it out. And then at a subset of plots, we also did botanical surveys using 4 point line intercept transects and a time search over the plot area, which is approximately 500 square meters. Okay, here's just a quick map showing you our survey plots over the 3 sites. The furthest points apart on the map are about 30 miles, and the points are symbolized here based on the number of fires that they've had over the past 50 years. So the Badger Pass area has had no fires. North Fork San Joaquin River Basin has had 1 to 2, and then the Illilouette Creek Basin has had a mix of 1, 2, or 3 times burned. Here's just a quick summary of the effort that was taken to collect this data over the past 2 summers. We surveyed 143 plots. 81 of those had botanical surveys. And then for the species counts, these are minimum species counts per site over the surveyed plots. I'm still working through some of the plant identifications, but I expect that the total number of species is actually going to be higher than what's listed here, and at least 500 species were identified over the whole study. Okay, I'm going to start talking about some results here. So in the box plot on the left, I've got species richness per plot for each site, and the points again are colored based on the number of times burned. And then along the x-axis, the sites are ordered based on the amount of managed wildfire that's occurred in that area. So we've got Badger Pass with no fires, North Fork San Joaquin with recent managed wildfire, and then the Illilouette with this long managed wildfire policy. And so Badger Pass and the North Fork San Joaquin River Basin are significantly different, and North Fork San Joaquin River Basin and Illilouette are significantly different, but the mean number of species between Badger Pass and Illilouette is actually pretty similar, even though the Illilouette has more variability across species richness across plots. And then on the right, what I'm showing is species richness by the year since last fire. The data set that I'm using only goes back to 1984, so that's why it sort of maxes out there on the far right. But actually, I think those numbers would be further out because the Badger Pass site hasn't burned for at least 70 years or longer. But in any case, what we're seeing here is that there's a lot more species richness in the first few years after the fire, and then that sort of levels off over time. And for fun and your entertainment and enjoyment, here's just some cute plants that we found in the field. We've got fireweed, smoky mariposa lilies, the Sierra stonecrop, Sierra tiger lily, this blushing monkey flower, and pine drops. I won't bother to read you the scientific names, but you can ask me later if you need to. Okay, and then looking at fuel loads across the sites. So the fuel load is in metric tons per hectare. It's the sum of the duff, litter, fine woody debris, and then large woody debris. And this calculation is not including live vegetation as fuel. So on the left, what we're looking at is total fuel loads per site. What stands out right away is that the Badger Pass site has some plots with pretty extreme fuel loads, whereas North Fork San Joaquin River Basin and the Illilouette are a lot more similar, and that's basically what we would expect given their more recent fire histories. And then on the right, what we're looking at is plot species richness by the log, pun intended, of total fuel. And we can see there's a negative relationship here. So as the total fuels on the ground increase at a site, what we're seeing is lower plant species diversity. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because if the ground is covered in sticks and logs, there's really no place for a seed to get established or for a plant to even survive. But of course, like everyone in this room is a botanist and ecologist in some way, and so we know that fuel load can't be the only thing that's determining species richness anywhere in the world. So I wanted to know what were some of the other factors that were influencing plant species richness, either along with or instead of the fuel loads. I identified these candidate predictors based on the field data that we had collected and used this AIC modeling selection to find the best model for predicting species richness. And from this list of candidate predictors, the AIC method selected these 5. We've got depth, number of fires, percent canopy cover, and then the log of total fuel load plus years since last fire. And these are the predictors of species richness based on this model. Here I'm showing the standardized effects and 95% confidence intervals for each of these selected predictors, just to illustrate the direction and magnitude of the effect on species richness. So for example, this one at the bottom, the year since last fire, that's having a strong negative effect. So that species richness is declining as the time since last fire increases, and that's, we all know that, I already told you. So a few key takeaways here are that few key takeaways from my preliminary analysis are that areas with different implementation of managed wildfire have more variability in patterns of species richness compared to unburned site, but not necessarily higher average species richness. And then understory species richness and the total fuel loads on the ground have an inverse relationship. Plant species richness seems to be influenced by factors like depth, the number of fires, canopy cover, total fuel loads, and time since last fire, which is providing some preliminary evidence that managed wildfire could support both fuel reduction goals and native plant diversity. And we're hoping that this work can help managers understand how to reintroduce good fire into some of California's fire-adapted landscapes while achieving these multiple resource objectives of reducing understory fuel loads and influencing plant species richness. As some of you know, there was a lightning strike on October 4th this year, which started the Red Fire, and that burned over 8,000 acres through the Illilouette Creek Basin as a managed wildfire. And because of the legacy of managed wildfire in that area, the fire burned with low to moderate severity effects and a few small patches of moderate to high severity effects. And this is really like good fire in action. It's decreasing fuel loads, increasing plant species richness, and limiting the severity and the risk of future wildfires. For next steps, I'm in the process of analyzing plant community composition across those plots and across the sites to get additional biodiversity metrics. And I'm also hoping to look into incorporating some other data sources like climatic data, remote sensing products, or historic data to analyze some more change over time. Thank you to CAL FIRE and UC Berkeley and Berkeley Forests for providing gracious funding for this work, and thank you very much. Okay, we have time for a few questions.
Hey, thanks for the research. How are the different fuel sizes weighted for the metric? And were you seeing heterogeneity roughly? Like if there's one that has a lot of dust, there's going to be less woody debris in general too, as a generality? And do you expect there to be interesting, like did you do any analysis on those specific fuel types, the sizes, compared to richness?
Yeah, I did. Can you hear me? I did look at the relationships with like dust, litter, and fine woody debris with species richness, and they were all pretty similar to with total fuel. I think the total fuel is a little more meaningful for plants on the ground. What's really driving that calculation is the large woody debris. So like at the Badger Pass site, there are, red fir trees this big around, and if 3 of those are on the ground on your transect, like you're going to get a really high fuel load. Did I miss a part of you? You had a couple questions. I might have missed one of them.
That was great. Thanks.
Okay, cool.
So, I'm wondering how much of the Sierra Nevada is currently set up for this to be positive?
versus like needing some pre-treatment to avoid a catastrophic fire?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm probably not the best person to answer that. There's probably some Forest Service folks in the room who would have a better answer. I mean, I would think my off-the-cuff answer is that I think a lot of areas, probably all the areas, need some pre-treatment. The Illilouette Creek Basin has basically had that pre-treatment through this legacy of managed wildfire. So yeah, I think you would need some pre-treatment. And I was going to say something else, and I forgot, but we'll talk more later.
I was wondering about the regeneration and the seed bank. Is that the seed from flora shrubs? I mean, what's their? Are they have an unending life expectancy under the duff, or is that being carried in by wind? Have they been lying there for?
Yeah, like in the regeneration of the post-burned areas.
Correct.
I would imagine it's probably a mixture of those things. I haven't looked at that exactly, but yeah, in the areas that haven't had fire, I don't know what the longevity of the seeds are, but for these areas that haven't burned for, let's say, 100 years, like it's hard to imagine that seeds can survive. We all know that there's evidence of seeds surviving like thousands of years, but in our systems, and I really don't know. But great question. I would love to know the answer.
Okay. So we have one more talk before you can all grab coffee. And it's actually my talk, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Michelle Coppoletta, and I'm an ecologist with the USDA Forest Service Regional Ecology Program. I'm actually situated in northeastern California, where I cover 3 national forests. I cover the Plumas, Lassen, and Modoc. But today I'm going to actually expand the boundary of my area of expertise and talk about all of California, because I really want to touch on some of what I consider to be the gems of the Forest Service in California. And these are research natural areas, or because I'm a government bureaucrat, I'm going to use an acronym, RNAs. So research natural areas in California are part of this really large national network of protected areas across the nation, and they were set aside for a key number of reasons. Research and monitoring, education, to protect these really beautiful biological hotspots of diversity, and really importantly, to serve as these important reference conditions that managers like myself can use to evaluate management actions in equivalent ecosystems. And they were selected to really try and represent all of the major vegetation types that we have here in California, all of the major dominant vegetation types. And right now we have 64 established RNAs on Forest Service lands in California. There are 36 that are currently kind of waiting in the wings to be established. They're recommended or proposed. And they're really diverse. They range in size from pretty small, less than 100 acres, all the way up to over 7,000 acres. And they're found on every national forest in California, all the way from the coast to the inland deserts, all the way from Southern California up to the subalpine forests in the Sierra Nevada. And although they represent this just tiny fraction of Forest Service lands in California, less than 0.5% of our Forest Service lands are found in RNAs, they really offer some of our very, very best representations of not only dominant vegetation types, but some of our really unique and rare species assemblages. And one of the guiding management principles in RNAs, like a lot of our protected natural areas, is to allow natural processes to prevail without human intervention. And this is a really wonderful and lofty goal. But as so many of us know, it's really hard to achieve. And we face a pretty big dilemma with managing these research natural areas. First of all, like all of us know, these ecosystems are incredibly dynamic. And they depend on these large landscape-scale disturbances like fire to really maintain and restore the plant communities that they're designed to protect. But unfortunately, a lot of our research natural areas are embedded within these really large managed landscapes, places where we've made some pretty big decisions about fire suppression and land management. And a lot of them are actually in pretty close proximity to human populations near urban areas. This is an example of an RNA in Southern California that I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. This is the Black Butte RNA. And as we can see, it's really close, less than 2 miles from Highway 101, and really close to the town of San Luis Obispo. So you can see how these factors would really hinder our ability to actually honestly allow disturbance processes like fire to actually proceed unencumbered. So considering this challenge of managing fire in these natural areas, my colleagues and I really started to ask a pretty simple question. Here are the gems of the Forest Service. They were set aside to really represent our best natural conditions. How departed are they from their actual natural fire regime? How challenging is it to actually manage fire in these systems? And we were interested in looking at 2 attributes of the fire regime: fire frequency. So we asked, are RNAs in California burning more or less frequently than we would expect under their pre-settlement or natural fire regime? And then the second metric we were interested in asking or looking at was fire severity. So when fires do burn within these protected natural areas, are they burning with severity patterns that are similar to what we might expect to have seen historically? And the first question we asked is, are these RNAs burning? Are we seeing fires within our RNAs? And this graph just shows the number of RNAs that have burned since 1984. And what you can't see on this graph is that 24 RNAs, or 37% of the RNAs that we have in California, have had no fire recorded within their boundaries since 1908. But 21 RNAs, or 32%, have actually burned in the last decade alone. And you can see that with that orange circle there. 17 have actually burned in just the last 4 years. And 15 have actually burned at least twice since 1984. So that's represented by those orange bars in this graph. And 2 RNAs have actually burned 4 times since 1984. So what this means is that about 2/3 of our RNAs have had at least one fire in the last 100 years, but most of those fires have occurred probably in the last 40 to 50 years. So our next question then was, with all of this increase in fire frequency, are we seeing these RNAs departure in fire frequency within these RNAs? And Marc touched briefly on the metric that we used to evaluate this. This is the fire return interval departure, or FRID. And this metric was developed as basically to compare estimates of pre-settlement fire return intervals with contemporary measurements of how frequently these systems are burning, basically before and after 1908. And it does this for different vegetation types. And what you can see here on this graph is the total area within RNAs that are within these kind of binned departure classes. So we have low departure, moderate departure, and high departure in terms of fire frequency. And what you can see here is that 68% of the RNAs in California are currently considered moderately to highly departed in terms of fire frequency. In the moderately to highly departed categories, 91% are burning less frequently than they would have historically, and 9% are actually burning more frequently. Now, you remember from that last graph that we've seen this really uptick in fires in the last 40 to 50 years. So we were also interested in asking, okay, is that enough to move the needle? Is contemporary or recent fire activity more closely aligned with pre-settlement fire frequency? So we did the same analysis looking at pre-settlement fire return intervals and comparing them to the current fire return interval between 1970 and 2021. And what we found is that the same number of RNAs are still departed. They're still in that kind of moderate to high category, but we did see a shift from those highly departed categories into that more moderate departure. And within that moderate category, we saw that about 38% are actually burning much more frequently now than we would have expected under their pre-settlement fire regime. When we looked at patterns of departure for individual vegetation types, we found that yellow pine and mixed conifer forest types, which are really common in our RNAs, and oak woodlands were the most departed plant communities within our protected natural areas. These systems were burning on average 2 to 4 times fewer or less than they would have historically. And chaparral and serotinous conifers and coastal sage scrub, which we actually heard a lot about yesterday in some of the chaparral sessions, were actually burning 2 to 4 times more frequently than they would have historically. So we're seeing departure in very different ways across California within these research natural areas. So with this kind of departure in fire frequency, it was really natural for us to ask, when an RNA does burn, when fires do re-enter these systems, are they burning with severity patterns that are similar to what we might expect under a pre-settlement fire regime? And to do this, we looked at 66 fires that occurred since 1984. They occurred within 42 RNAs. And I'm just going to present some of our findings for plant communities that were really characterized historically by these frequent low to moderate severity fire regimes. And what you can see on this graph, again, is the number of area within RNAs within these low, moderate, and high departure categories. And those departure categories were calculated prior to that fire that we were analyzing. And the different bars represent the fire severity that resulted within those areas. So you can see that in highly departed systems, so in areas where fires were burning significantly less frequently than they would have historically, we were seeing a greater proportion of that landscape burn at high severity. We found about 23% of the landscape in departed areas burning at high severity. And just as a benchmark, Marc mentioned natural range of variation assessments. And when we think about historically the patterns of fire severity in these systems, we would expect that high severity would rarely exceed about 10% of that landscape, usually ranging from about 3 to 15%. So we're seeing significantly higher rates or proportions of high severity fire in some of our more departed ecosystems. This isn't really true in some of our low and moderate departure categories. In these areas, we were finding that high severity made up about 6 to 11% of the landscape, so well within that kind of historic range that we would expect. So what this says to me is that even in these protected natural areas, which have been set aside to kind of represent our best approximations of these ecological conditions, these reference sites, that we're seeing pretty fundamental alterations to one of our basic ecological processes, which is fire. And what we're seeing is fewer fires and vegetation types that have historically experienced frequent low-severity fire, and that when fires do re-enter these systems after these long fire-free periods, we're finding that there's an increased risk that they're burning at high severity. We're also finding a lot more frequent fire in systems that once burned very infrequently with high severity fire effects. And as we heard from a lot of the sessions yesterday, we're finding similar significant impacts within RNAs to some of those very target elements that these RNAs were actually set aside to protect. So I want to take you on a tour of a few case studies of the RNAs just to highlight some of the issues that we're seeing in terms of management. This is the Indiana Summit RNA. It's on the Inyo National Forest. It's a little over 1,000 acres. It's in that kind of higher elevation band. It's the oldest RNA in our system. It was established in 1932, and it's never been harvested. And it was set aside to protect these beautiful stands of Jeffrey pine, which, as a lot of us know, are adapted to frequent low-severity fire. So historically, on average, these stands would have burned about every 11 years. And up until recently, the fire history in the Indiana Summit RNA was pretty similar to a lot of the RNAs that we have in California. We had very little fire. You can see that there was a small lightning-ignited fire kind of in the southern part of the RNA, about 40 acres, that burned in 1986. And then in 1994, forest managers were able to actually implement a prescribed burn on about 74 acres. But outside of those two kind of small fires, the remainder of that RNA was pretty far departed. It looked a lot like what we see in the bottom picture here, and it hadn't had fire for over 100 years. In 2016, the Clark fire burned the entire RNA. 35% of the RNA burned at high severity, so what this means is more than 75% loss in overstory canopy. And one large continuous high severity patch actually covered about a quarter of the RNA. So we're seeing pretty significant impacts in terms of fire severity. In 2021, the Dexter fire actually reburned a very small proportion of the RNA, and it burned really fortuitously into an area that had burned in the Clark fire at low to moderate severity. So 93% of that Dexter fire actually burned with pretty nice low to moderate severity fire effects. And we're really lucky to have some great monitoring information collected by Marc Meyer over here when he wasn't in red fur. And what he did was he compared fire effects and resulting forest structure in areas that had been previously treated with prescribed fire and areas that had been untreated or were pretty far departed. And what he found was pretty, what we would expect. Areas that were far departed in terms of fire frequency burned at much higher severity. We saw much more severe fire behavior with over 50% loss of some of those really large old-growth trees. In areas that we were able to actually treat with prescribed fire prior to the Clark fire, we saw much more moderated fire behavior, higher survival of large trees, and post-fire tree densities that were really nicely aligned with some of those historic estimates that we have for Jeffrey pine forests in this region. And so the take-home here is that prescribed fire and or managed wildfire, like the Dexter fire, within an RNA can really moderate future wildfire behavior and effects. And that's not surprising to anyone sitting in this room, I'm sure. But what I think is really important to think about is that this is a proactive approach in a protected research natural area. Okay, a second example, very different place. This is the one I highlighted earlier in my talk on the map. This is the Black Butte RNA in Southern California. It's on the Los Padres National Forest. It's about 540 acres. It's embedded within the Santa Lucia Wilderness, even though it's less than a few miles from Highway 101. The target element that this RNA was established to protect was knobcone pine, which is one of our serotinous pine species, and some montane chaparral, or chaparral. And this has a very different fire regime. These were adapted to very infrequent, high-severity fires operating at a frequency of about 55 years. It also has a very different fire history than a lot of our RNAs. It had really frequent fire over the last 100 years. And actually, between 1922 and 1985, you can see that these fires were occurring at that kind of nice, longer fire return interval. But then starting in about 1985, we have a series of about 4 fires that occurred at really short intervals. And what that means is that right now, about 75% of the RNA is burning 2 to 3 times more frequently than we would expect under the pre-settlement fire regime. And this has some pretty significant impacts to those target elements that the RNA was designed to protect. John Keeley actually did a great study after the 1984 and 1994 fires, where they found that 20% of this landscape actually lacked knobcone pine regeneration. And when they looked at the density of pine regeneration in this RNA, they found that it was insufficient to actually replace the pre-fire stand structure. And that's really similar to what he actually presented yesterday for some more recent fires. So what this means is that this increased fire frequency actually increases the risk of localized extinction of some of those obligate seeding shrubs and serotinous knobcone pine species that this RNA was actually designed to protect. So here, we have a really different management strategy and a take-home message. Here, we really need to be more proactive about fire suppression, which is absolutely necessary to actually reduce the threat of frequent fires and actually maintain the target elements within this RNA. So how do we manage these natural areas? It's a real challenge. And I will say one thing, and it's not just because I'm a scientist or an ecologist and I love research and monitoring, which I do, but I think research and monitoring is really key in these areas. And surprisingly, these areas are very understudied. So if anyone wants to study them, let me know, because I issue the permits. But, but I think these areas are also really diverse and really complex. And if we can learn a lot more about how these species are not only adapted to fire, but how departed they are from their natural fire regime, we'll be much more well poised to actually manage them when a fire occurs. Another thing we need to do is be prepared. We know fires are going to re-enter these systems, and we need to develop management strategies before they burn. So understanding, that where conditions are feasible and where we have the conditions that are suitable, that we need to have the management structure and the leadership support to allow these fires to burn. And in other areas, especially in Southern California and some of our chaparral systems and serotinous systems, we need to consider really using fire suppression techniques. And because these are natural areas, we need to think about how we can fight fire in a much more or less impactful way. So using minimum impact suppression techniques, using natural borders and hand tools where feasible. And really something that we don't often think about in wilderness areas or natural resource research areas is we need to be proactive. We need to think about how we can use tools like prescribed fire, like managed fire, and in some cases fuel reduction techniques to actually make these systems a lot more resilient to future fires, because they are going to burn. And we want to set these conditions up so that when fires do burn, they're burning in an ecologically relevant way. So just in conclusion, our natural areas in California offer some of our best approximations of minimally disturbed ecosystems on federal lands. But surprisingly and alarmingly, alteration of the natural fire regime in a lot of these places has put a lot of them at pretty high risk of degradation and in some cases loss. And so I think that monitoring and in some cases proactive management and stewardship is going to be really necessary to actually ensure that we can maintain some of these target elements on the landscape for the future. I think that's all I have. Thank you. Sorry. I know it's coffee time, so.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
No, you're good. Oh my gosh, I wasn't chasing you. I'm sorry.
Twice, thanks. Are the once and twice burned by like lightning fires or whatever, are they pretty well prepped for putting fire on the ground?
I would say in some cases, yes, but it's really dependent on the severity of those fires. So in places where they burned at low to moderate severity, because these areas most of them have never been logged or harvested, they're really set up well to have either managed fire or prescribed fire. In places, if you saw Kyle Merriam's talk yesterday, in some places that have burned at high severity, we're really poised to reburn again at high severity. So we're kind of going in a different trajectory in some of these places, but it's really dependent on how those fires burned. Yeah.
Do it anyway.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm wondering if anybody's doing research on the animals and the change to the animal populations on these sites.
Within different research natural areas, we have various projects going on looking at wildlife, but I don't know of any off the top of my head that's looking at the interaction of kind of fire regime departure and wildlife species in these areas. There you go. Contact me.
Hi, I was just curious about in these natural areas, so they're like a hands-off, like so humans aren't involved, and you're talking about pre-settlement, but I'm just kind of curious if, you kind of talked to the Indigenous peoples of the region and how they've been managed pre-colonization.
Absolutely. Yes, and that's a really good point, and it's probably telling about when our Forest Service manual was actually written in the 1980s. That is definitely a very important piece. And I think there's a misconception that research natural areas are hands-off. That's not true. We have the ability to go in and be proactive and manage these landscapes, and applying fire, especially Indigenous fire, is going to be a key part of that. But I think, so I think that, yeah, sorry. I lost my train of thought. I need coffee. Yeah.
One more question.
Pre-settlement absolutely involves cultural and Indigenous burning. I mean, you can't really disentangle, past fire with naturally or human-ignited causes. So pre-settlement is basically pure pre-Euro-American settlement, and so 1908 is what we use as kind of the cutoff.
Hi. What do you think with the Forest Service is the best way to be proactive in chaparral areas that you mentioned have much less frequent, more severe fires? What's a good way to be proactive with that besides just suppression of fire?
I think suppression is really a key piece of that. A lot of these places are pretty they're not degraded by a lot of past activities. They're in pretty good shape. And so fire is probably the number one threat in a lot of these systems. So I think fire suppression and fire exclusion is really important, at least in the short term. I think it is a really important piece, and maybe one of our most feasible management actions that we can do in these systems. Yeah. But not forever. We want fire in them at the appropriate ecological intervals. Yeah.
I love that question because it's related to my question or comment, which is other tools like targeted ecological grazing, right, is maybe more appropriate in some of those areas where you're trying to keep it excluded for a longer period of time.
I didn't hear that last part, sorry.
Oh, where you're trying to keep fire excluded for a longer period of time to meet those management objectives.
Yeah. I mean, targeted grazing could be an option. I think in Southern California, and a lot of our RNAs in Southern California, the biggest threat is human ignitions rather than fuel issues. So if we can manage fuels around the RNAs, then we can really keep fire out of there. I think introducing a non-native grazer might be a little tricky in terms of mimicking that natural process, but it could be an option. Yeah. Okay.
One last question.
Blake, you're the last one.
You mentioned wilderness and the overlap.
Yeah.
Often our RNAs are in wilderness areas, and that adds another layer of challenge to active management. I was wondering if some of the higher frequency fire RNAs that are lacking fire, do those tend to be more outside wilderness? Like, did you look at like Indiana Summit's outside of wilderness?
Yeah.
Do you think there's opportunity there, or is that is that also tying our hands in some of those situations?
Yes, that is definitely tying our hands. And one of the frustrations that I have with some of our Forest Service policy is that it is really easy to suppress fires in wilderness areas. We've seen this much more recently with some of our large fires in the Sierra Nevada. We can put bulldozer lines through wilderness. We can dig hand lines with certain exceptions. But it is incredibly hard to actually light a match and be proactive with burning in wilderness areas. So I didn't look at whether departure is higher in wilderness areas than out, but I would suspect it probably is. And it is just another level of complexity that really hinders our ability to actually and honestly manage fire in these landscapes. Yeah. Well, I want to let you all get on to your break. So thank you so much for attending this session.